Hello and welcome to the first Wednesday webinar in 2020 from the IEA Clean Coal Centre. My name is Benedicta Brox and I'm the Communications Officer here. Our monthly webinars are based on our technical reports, which are available from our website. Residents of member countries and employees of sponsoring organizations can download our reports at no charge after a one-off registration. The subject for today's webinar is the role of coal in the energy trilemma, presented by Dr. Leslie Slauson.
Thank you, Benedicta, and welcome to the webinar. As Benedicta says, this is from my new report, which should be published within the next month or so. So here we go with coal with your coffee and trilemma on your tea break. Now, the energy trilemma is quite a heavy topic. It reaches into several areas of policy and science, and so I'm going to begin this talk today by explaining how the energy trilemma is defined and the factors which influence how a country performs within the energy trilemma index as it's defined. And as I go, I will discuss coal and how it has dominated the trilemma and continues to do so in some regions, and how this may change as we move towards decarbonisation. So the energy trilemma has different definitions depending on who you hit first on Google, but the general definition can be summarised as shown here. It's the balance between the security of your energy supply, the sustainability of the chain producing that energy, and the ultimate cost to consumers, both industrial and public. Now, the energy trilemma is commonly visualised by this triangle, with one of the three factors at each of those corners. Now, since energy costs, energy availability, and climate issues are under rapid development and change, the trilemma for any country is not stagnant. Rather, it's constantly changing, being pulled in different directions as things change. And the major influencers are listed here. The transformation of the energy supply. So for many countries, especially in developed regions, this means the move away from coal to variable renewable energy sources, or VRE, such as wind and solar. But it can also refer to regions such as the Middle East, which are diversifying their energy mix and moving into coal for some of their baseload power. Or it could also refer to Japan, where the Fukushima incident forced a rapid switch from nuclear power back to coal and other alternative baseload options. Advancing access to energy applies to regions such as India, where around 300 million people still do not have access to the electricity grid. 300 million people, that's a whole new America or Canada coming onto the grid, and so that's a significant new source of power that has to be found. Consumer affordability and industry competitiveness refers to the economic mechanisms such as taxes and tariffs, which can increase or lower the cost of the electricity to influence the market. So this can mean electricity subsidies to those who would not otherwise be able to afford power, or it can mean tweaking power payment rates to promote the sales of wind or solar energy into the grid over and above coal or gas. Improving energy efficiency and managing demand benefits everyone. Obviously, higher efficiency coal plants produce more power from less coal, and so do so more cleanly and with greater flexibility, if possible. Managing demands relates to making end users more efficient, but it also deals with managing the balance between energy supply and energy demand. And as we'll see, renewable power is non-dispatchable. So sources such as coal and gas are still relied upon in many regions to provide power when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow. And finally, decarbonising the energy sector. The aim of the Paris Agreement is to reduce CO2 emissions to the atmosphere, and so decarbonisation of energy and transport is the main goal. And so this webinar and the associated report aims to answer these questions. Is phasing coal out, is it achievable? How do we deal with the challenge of providing baseload power to growing economies with increased renewables when renewables are not yet ready to provide baseload? And can coal actually help with all of this? Can coal be part of the solution? Now, I've included these figures as they highlight some of the reasons why there's a disparity in the approach of different countries and regions to the phasing out of fossil fuels and the move towards decarbonisation. It's quite a busy picture, but it's actually quite a really interesting picture. It shows the difference between the OECD, the westernized regions, as shown here, and the next slide relates to non-OECD countries. And it shows the differences with respect to their views on how important different dimensions and factors within the energy trilemma are. So for example here, the blue dots show factors relating to energy equity. That's the cost and the affordability of power. The red dots relate to energy security, making sure the lights switch on when you press that little button. And the green dots relate, as you would expect, to environmental sustainability and environmental issues. So the further along the x-axis to the right there, the dots are, that shows an increase in their perceived importance. The higher they are up the x-axis, the height of the chart there, shows how uncertain they are. So for OECD countries, as shown here, the red dot for cybersecurity is actually quite prominent at the top right there, indicating that it's assumed to have a potentially very high impact on energy security in the regions. But it's also highly uncertain. No one knows when it and if it will happen and how bad any effects might be. Conversely, at the bottom left in blue, we see that energy access is actually not much of a concern in this region. Most of the population in the OECD region have access to reliable and affordable energy at all times. The areas of most concern, along in the bottom right there, are the environmental issues in green, the efficiency issues, renewable energy, and the climate frameworks. By comparison, the non-OECD countries. This shows that environmental concerns in green, such as renewables and efficiency, are also important, but the climate issues are somewhat less so. Right up at the front there, we see economic growth and electricity prices dominating the concern for the region. Cyber threats are pretty low down on the list of things to worry about. So these two slides show the perceived importance of issues within the energy trilemma. But let's have a look at the practicalities of trying to make changes within the energy trilemma. This graph is from the World Energy Forum, and it shows different regions of the world. The x-axis shows the readiness of these countries to decarbonize. So at the left here, we have countries like the United Kingdom, Germany, the USA, Canada, and China, ranking quite highly, showing that they're actually moving towards decarbonisation and they have the technical and economic abilities to do so. Russia, India, and Iran, more on the right there, have more of a challenge ahead of them. Now, the width of the x-axis shows the volume of emissions that need to be addressed. And so the United Kingdom, on the left there, is relatively ready to decarbonise and has relatively low emissions already. So the challenge is significantly less than for, say, China, which is relatively ready to act, but has a significant challenge in terms of the sheer volume of emissions that must be controlled. Okay, so now let's understand what the energy trilemma means in challenges towards moving towards the cleaner energy sector. So let's look at the three sectors of the triangle separately. First, we have energy security. That is, put simply, the desire to ensure that when we flick that light switch, the light will always come on. Strong economies cannot be built without a secure energy supply. India has actually declared that access to electricity is a legal right. Access to electricity has been identified as the biggest obstacle facing businesses in low-income countries, outweighing any effects from access to finance, corruption, and other political instability issues. Access to power overrides all of these other concerns. 1.7 billion people gained access to electricity for the first time between 1990 and 2010, and of those, around 93% did so through coal. There are a further 1 billion people who still do not have access to grid power. These people's lives, education, health and welfare will improve drastically as they move onto the grid, and we must ensure that they do so, whilst at the same time ensuring that this new power demand is met in a sustainable way. Now, I gave a webinar last year that you can get on Catch Up via our website on the need for flexibility within the energy mix, and there are numerous other Clean Coal Centre reports on this which you can download for free. Now, most renewable sources of energy, wind and solar, are either not consistent, not predictable, or not dispatchable. That means that you can't assume that they're going to be there when you need them, and they cannot be relied upon to form the basis of a secure energy systems. Hospitals, schools, industries, and so on, these need reliable power at all times. So until significant advancements are made in batteries and energy storage, renewable energy simply cannot supply baseload to a full modern economy. It can be part of the mix, but it cannot be all of the mix. That is why, despite reduction in coal and gas in many regions, coal and gas have not been removed completely. They will remain until another feasible baseload alternative is found. And as my report concludes, energy security and the reliable and consistent delivery of energy to a population is by far the strongest pull of any corner of the energy trilemma. Until the intermittency and dispatchability of renewables can be addressed, grids have to cope with far more variable input and have to deal with greater fluctuation. And this requires significant upgrades to many interconnectors and grid systems, and this can disrupt the electricity supply and it can make it more expensive. So Fatih Birol, who's the executive director of the IEA in Paris, has stated categorically that renewable energy systems are causing a step change in the energy market. And this will need to be facilitated carefully to ensure the security of energy supply. So the point of this is that, yes, we want as much renewable energy as we can possibly get onto the grid, but at the moment the grid is not ready for the intermittency and the variability of renewables, and baseloads such as coal, oil, gas and nuclear are still required. So let's move on to the second corner of the trilemma, the cost. Energy affordability is not just the cost of coal or building a wind farm. It must also take into account build costs, operation, maintenance, grid costs, distribution, and all of that. Plus, there are market mechanisms such as tariffs and taxes that can change basic costs quite significantly. For example, let's look at this graph of household electricity bills in the European Union region. And what we see is that it includes charges over and above the basic costs of electricity production. So the price of energy as sold by the energy distributor, be it wind, solar, coal, gas or nuclear, or as it will be a mix of all of these, that's shown in dark blue. That's the cost of producing the energy and the electricity. And it amounts to half or less of the actual bill presented to the consumer. The remainder is made up of network costs, shown in pink, which are the costs of energy distribution and grid maintenance, and taxes and levies in green, which are set by the government. And so as the graph shows, in the last decade or so, the cost of electricity production has actually stayed relatively stable, that big blue base load at the bottom. The increase in household bills seen throughout Europe has been due to rising network costs to cope with the required increased flexibility of the grid as renewables ramp up, and an increase in taxes and levies, which are used to promote the uptake of these greener energies. Now, I cover the cost of electricity in a bit more detail in the full report, but I also suggest you check out Toby Lockwood's new report on the capacity market and mechanisms, and also, of course, Mo Udden's excellent webinar on coal funding, which is perhaps one of the best webinars we've produced so far, in my opinion. Now, I've included this slide, which is a little bit complicated, so hang in there, for a good reason. It shows a real practical demonstration of the balance governments create between energy security and energy cost, and why energy security will always trump. In January 2017, there was a prolonged cold period in Europe, very cold, and it coincided with a period when the nuclear plants were down and when there was a significant lack of wind. Also, because it was cold, electricity consumption was going up because people were heating their homes. Add on top of that, coal deliveries on the Danube being hindered because the Danube actually froze over. On top of that, the French interconnectors also went down during this period. So it was a little bit of chaos within the European energy grid. Demand and supply of electricity became an issue, and some countries such as Greece and Bulgaria curtailed or even halted their exports for weeks at a time. So the figure on the left shows the cost of electricity as it went up in each of the regions shown here. So at the beginning of January, the costs were relatively stable. And then when this issue, this cluster of disasters kicked in all at once, we see the cost of electricity increasing by orders of magnitude in all of the countries, Bulgaria through to Serbia and Greece. Now, at the beginning, so on the graph on the right, the 13th, that's when Bulgaria decided to halt its power exports. So we see Bulgaria in pink dropping off of that shared grid. It's prioritised keeping its own energy production for its own national needs. Now, we can see that it's disengaged its costs. They're not, they're much lower than the other countries in the region. Also, I mean, they're changing, they're going up and down as demand goes up and down in other regions, but the costs paid within Bulgaria were significantly lower. This shows how countries with access to regional and international grids will always prioritise their own national demand. This is how countries work. It demonstrates in practice what this report effectively concludes. Energy security will always be the greatest influencer within the energy trilemma. And in this instance, Bulgaria prioritised delivery and also affordability of power nationally by withdrawing from the shared international grid. One final point on energy costs before I move on is that coal has been a major employer in many regions and is the basis of many regional economies. As countries move away from conventional coal, there can be significant knock-on effects in terms of employment and social welfare. As this graph shows, regions such as Poland have large numbers employed directly and indirectly in the coal chain. There are just transitions, they call them, requirements within the EU to show that as countries decarbonise, actions are taken to ensure that the social consequences are minimised. The issue of economic and strategic value of coal in issues such as social welfare and employment is covered in another report by the Clean Coal Centre by Paul Baruya, which I believe is out in draft at the moment. So let's move to the final corner of the energy trilemma triangle, the environmental corner. Much of the pull of this corner is a response from countries to meet environmental priorities such as the Paris Climate Agreement and the UN Sustainable Goals. Now, individual countries make their own decisions as to how they will comply with the Paris Agreement and how they plan to reduce their CO2. Most of these actions, as you would expect, focus on the energy sector. And most of Western Europe, as shown in this graph, are phasing out coal. France, the UK, and the Netherlands, Italy, and Portugal all have timelines for plant closure, as shown here. And I think Germany's just announced 2038 or something for theirs. However, Eastern European countries, shown in pink here, do not have such targets. Now, under the Paris Agreement, signatory countries are required to submit what's called a nationally determined contribution, in which they show how they're going to continue with their energy use and so on. And the World Coal Association has produced this map here, which shows countries which have specifically named and admitted that they're keeping coal within their NDCs. However, it's important to note that each of these countries has identified a role for HELE, that's high efficiency, low emissions coal technologies within their NDCs. And that means that they intend to move where possible to significantly cleaner and more efficient plants, and potentially to use CCUS where feasible. Countries such as China, South Africa, and the USA have actually made direct or indirect references to increasing CCUS within their NDCs. Excuse me. Now, this graph shows the reductions in CO2 and methane required under the IEA Sustainable Development Scenario, or SDS. So the orange long line along the top there shows the new policy scenario. These are CO2 emissions over the next couple of decades based on what we plan to do. This is what's happening if we do not change the way we are going. So this includes all the new commitments that have been made. So CO2 emissions are actually only going to stabilise a little. We are not on target to reduce emissions of CO2 globally. The world is not on track to achieve the energy-related components of the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, the IEA has a Sustainable Development Scenario, SDS, shown in green at the bottom graph here. This is where we want to be. However, it requires a major transformation of the global energy system. The challenge is to deliver on three main energy-related Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. These are to achieve universal access to energy, for example, the 300 million in India, to reduce severe health impacts of air pollution, and to tackle climate change, all within those and that Sustainable Development Scenario. At the same time, it aims to limit the global temperature rise to below 1.8 degrees C. For this, global CO2 emissions must fall from 33 billion tonnes in 2018 to less than 10 billion tonnes by 2050. And we should be on track to meet net zero emissions by 2070. And so the World Energy Outlook admits that we're going to have to do significantly more than we are doing now, over and above the new policy scenario, to get us to that SDS target. And these changes relate largely to emissions from coal, oil and gas, as you would expect. Around 1/3 of the reductions, shown in blue at the top there, should come through efficiency improvements, along with reforms of the fossil fuel subsidies to promote a move away from conventional fossil fuels. Around a third of the emissions, as shown in green, could be achieved by replacing fossil fuels with renewable energy and by closing the most inefficient coal plants first. A small amount of emission reduction in orange could come from controlling methane leakage from upstream oil and gas, and the remainder, purple, will be achieved through replacement of some of the fossil fuel plants with nuclear plants or by fuel switching to gas or biomass, but also through the application of carbon capture and storage to the remaining fossil fuel plants which continue to run. Now, the World Energy Outlook also includes a proposal for reducing emissions to align with the SDS goals as shown here. So the new policy scenario, as shown in yellow, shows us continuing to increase our CO2 emissions into the future, despite all our best intentions at the moment. The future is electric scenario, in solid purple, assumes full electrification of the transport sector, thus a move from end fuel use onto the grid. This reduces emissions a little, but only because it has moved fuel combustion from cars to coal-fired power plants or nuclear plants, which now produce the electricity for the car fleet. And of course, emissions from single stationary sources are more efficient and easier to control than emissions from the current transport fleet. In purple, we see electrification and decarbonisation. That's a full move away from the car fleet to the electrification of the cars, plus carbon capture and storage on the sources producing this new source of power for that electric fleet. But even all this electrification is not going to get us down to the SDS goals. Emissions from industry, such as cement, non-ferrous and ferrous metals production, will need to be addressed. So it's important to note that the electrification of this car fleet adds significant new demand onto the grid, which needs to be baseload. So although we can increase our renewable energy, which will help, new nuclear and fossil plants will be necessary in the immediate future to provide enough reliable electricity for everyone to switch to an electric car. Now, as I said, the IEA SDS goals are extremely challenging, with a dramatic increase required in renewable energy deployment as well as carbon capture and storage. The SDS, however, acknowledges that coal and other fossil fuels will remain in the energy mix for decades, as shown here. So we see here on the left, in green, the uptake increase in VRE, variable renewable energies, wind and solar and so on, increasing dramatically between now and 2040 under the new policy scenario, as shown in green, and what we would need to increase that by in lighter green to achieve the SDS goals. In the same way, the uptake of electric cars, as shown in blue, is going to have to be significantly accelerated to achieve the SDS goals and not just the new policy scenario. CCS deployment, shown in yellow-orange, is going to have to be taken far more seriously in order to help with reaching the SDS goals between now and 2040, as the gap between that new policy scenario and the SDS goal is significant. And finally, and shown on the right there in rusty red, the fossil fuel share of the energy mix is required to grow rapidly. That's the non-fossil fuel mix there. But fossil fuel will also continue and make up the remainder, almost 60% of the global energy mix in 2040. So even under the most ambitious of goals for the future energy supply, coal clearly is remaining firmly in that energy mix. Now, this graph shows that under the SDS goals, coal demand and production will decline by over 50% between now and 2040. But it also shows that significant quantities of coal will still be vital to the world economy in 2040. Some of it will be industrial, non-power applications, such as cement and non-ferrous metal production. So how are we going to decarbonise if we are still continuing to burn carbon? We can, of course, use more renewable energy, but as I've shown, until intermittency and dispatchability issues are addressed, coal is needed and often prioritised for energy security. We can reduce the emissions from coal if we continue to burn by improving our efficiency of our plants, from conventional coal combustion at around 34% to new HELI systems, which are heading towards achieving 45% efficiency or more. And of course, we can capture the CO2 and get rid of it. So taking the challenges of the energy trilemma into account, the security, the affordability and the sustainability, how can we move logically and sensibly and affordably into decarbonisation? Now, these slides are produced by Andy Boston at Red Vector. Boston modelled the energy and grid challenges for several countries, including Australia, which is shown here, looking at how these regions may achieve deep decarbonisation within the 2050 Paris climate goal, but in the most affordable manner. Now, this model for Australia looked at 3 possible pathways to decarbonisation. These included building just renewables, building just gas, new build combined cycle gas turbines, or moving to coal with carbon capture and storage for both brown and black coal fire plants. Now, each of these options is great for reducing emissions, but each has limitations. So on the left graph in green, we see that the increasing uptake of renewables will be cost effective for the first 50%, say, of reductions, but then it will get really expensive because, as I've said, VRE is not baseload, and now we're paying to compensate for the cost of storage or batteries to offset this. And so the cost goes up when we hit the maximum feasible uptake. Similarly, in orange, we can continue to add new gas plants, which release less CO2 than coal because they have higher efficiency. And this can be cost effective up to a point, but then it suddenly gets super expensive when we run out of affordable gas and have to start importing, or we have problems with storage. Finally, the new coal build, which is in a sort of purpley grey colour there, this is the most expensive option at the moment. But once our use of VRE and gas start to get more expensive, the carbon capture and storage actually becomes the most effective choice. And so rather than trying to go all renewables or all gas or all carbon capture and storage, we need to use them all, and we need to do it in a sensible, planned and phased manner, as shown in the right there. So there is proposed that there could be 3 phases for decarbonisation for Australia, starting with the rapid uptake of the renewables in phase 1. And then once that starts to get really expensive and the grid starts to complain about the variability and intermittency, we add on gas. And then this will give us time to make advancements in carbon capture and storage, make it affordable and commercial, and then we bring that in phase 3. So this study emphasises that although variable renewable energy sources are going to be a significant factor in decarbonisation, carbon capture and storage and flexibility are vital for all the Paris agreements and the Sustainable Development Goals to be met, whilst keeping the lights on. So the balance of the trilemma is not simple. It's often the case that the most reliable and affordable energy options are not the best in terms of sustainability. Moving to cleaner options can often be expensive, and it can cause issues with the existing gas grid infrastructure. Financial mechanisms can help, but they can also adversely affect energy costs, and they can disrupt the energy market. And since it's clear that coal looks set to remain in the energy mix for decades to come, we must move towards taking as much action as we can to make any continued coal use as clean and efficient as we possibly can. Coal is often the most available, affordable and reliable option for new power sources, and therefore it continues to be the first choice for new power in emerging regions such as developing Asia. It's therefore important that new coal investments are HELI systems, the highest efficiency and low emissions possible, and they should be carbon capture, utilisation, storage ready. So thank you for listening. These are the take-home messages. Make the plants as clean and as efficient as you possibly can, because we're going to need them as we use the technologies as a bridge towards decarbonisation. Coal remains in the mix, so it should be a clean option within that energy mix. So thank you for listening. I can take some questions online now for those that are listening live, or you can email me. My email address is at the bottom there, and I am quite responsive to emails, so please feel free to ping me a message. Oh, a question. Is there a role for public financing for CCUS? That's an interesting question, a little bit outside my remit, but thank you for that. Yes, I mean, I think for CCUS, we need to do everything and everything to get CCUS uptake going at a faster rate. I mean, from what we've discussed today, it's clear that CCUS is part of the solution, and it's a definite required part of the solution. So if somebody can finance it privately or publicly, then yes, please do so. At the moment, a lot of it is private. Public financing we've seen in the past issues. The UK tried to raise funding for a demonstration project 10 years ago now, and there was a call for bids, and that seemed to have died away. However, recently they have announced, I think it's 60 million for CCUS within the UK on industrial and commercial sources at the each of the industrial hubs in the region. I think they've named 6. I would Google that if I were you. And the Centre for Energy Policy in Glasgow is working on that. So yes, the short answer, yes, public financing will move things forward and make it more acceptable. So yes, please. Sorry, there are more questions popping in. I'll try and deal with these as best I can. Why would the cost of renewables come to a point where renewables are expensive when currently all trends are showing that the cost per megawatt hour have been decreasing? It's difficult to understand why the cost will be more than that of CCS, and I haven't mentioned nuclear. Oh, a lot of questions in there. I haven't mentioned nuclear because we're not experts on nuclear. Nuclear is brilliant baseload. It's super reliable baseload. However, it tends to bring a lot of emotion to the argument. Personally, I think nuclear is a very important part of the baseload mix, but some people do not see it that way, so I kind of excluded it from the discussions here today. It is mentioned in the report, though. To go back to the cost of renewables, yes, the renewable cost is coming down, and that is amazing. The cost problem, why it suddenly becomes more expensive, is because at the moment you can't go up to 100% renewable on the grid. There comes a point where you need backup. You need to be bringing in, for example, the UK has backup gen sets, diesel generators, backup storage. They pay people to come off the grid. There has to be ways of balancing to ensure base load, and you cannot go up to 100% renewables. And so there's a cost associated with a certain point at which you've got too many renewables on the grid and you have to do something about it. I don't know if I've explained that, but I have in the report, so please go to that. And somebody else has said, I haven't mentioned nuclear. Couldn't that be a substitute for clean coal in the future? Absolutely. Absolutely, nuclear is obviously an option. Could please explain the most detailed examples on heli technology? I have a report on this. There's a separate report. I think I gave the webinar in November on this, where I discussed the different potential current available heli technologies and new technologies coming on, such as IEACCC, fuel cells, and so on. So please refer to that webinar for information on that answer. Question on, can we use Article 6 of the Paris Agreement for financing carbon capture and utilisation of storage? Coal-abundant countries could move directly to CCUS rather than finding natural gas, especially China, South Africa, with the base energy and coal's abundant sunshine. Okay, I'm not up to date with the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, but yes, hopefully somebody will be able to leverage funding for financing CCUS. Sorry, there's hundreds of questions bringing in. Alex from India, we are having more than 150 thermal power plants, and the efficiency is lower. State of insolvency, power purchase agreements. Yes, India has a significant challenge with funding their current energy supply, especially with new emission standards coming in. And we're actually starting a new State Department project in India, which I'll possibly talk about next month. So if I can defer that question on India to then, or if the person who emailed that in can email me, I can answer that directly. Okay, one last question. How effective are the questions of CO2 storage being addressed, and will that not stop the carbon capture options being employed? Yes, that's huge. You can capture the CO2, but if you haven't got anywhere to put it, then that is a major issue. It's also an issue that's been addressed in several previous reports from the Clean Coal Centre. So once again, I'll direct you to our publications and webinars page. Thank you for that. Sorry I haven't answered all your questions. Email me and I will do. Sorry, there's a question being thrust at me from the side. Renewable enhances energy security by increasing self-sufficiency. Are there examples where the availability of renewables has damaged security? Yes, there are examples. I can't remember off the top of my head, but yes, there have been issues where renewable energies, there are too many, and they've shut down the grid. We have issues with that. But there also, on the other side of that, there's some the self-sufficiency. Lots of regions in Africa where they're using renewables, but they're not on the grid. So they've kind of solved their own problem and not created grid issues while increasing renewables. These are all very complex questions, guys. I'm sorry if I've muddled my way through the answers. Hopefully the report will have the answers for you. If not, I shall be replying to your emails directly. Okay, the slides from this webinar should be available from download webinar page of the website. You can also get it on catch up on YouTube fairly soon, I believe. The next webinar is going to be on the 19th of February at 12 o'clock, that's lunchtime, and it's going to be on non-energy products from coal, and it will be presented by our colleague, Dr. Ian Reid. So thank you all for joining us today. Goodbye, and I'll presumably hear from a lot of you by email. Thank you.